Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Strange Horizon. We have a usually I would say very interesting, very awesome episode, but in this case, I'm going to say very informative episode where we're going to go over a news article that basically has been framed in a way that I think is it's hard to tell whether they framed it in purpose to be misleading or whether just generally it's confusing and people are being misled by it. So I just wanted to go over this very interesting article titled, "A Look Inside People's Brains Who Say They've Had a UFO Encounter." So before I start, I just want to quickly say that for those who have been following Second Earth news, you might be thinking, dude, what's the difference? Well, truth be told, my other channel, Second Earth, had a hybrid, not just only UFO videos, but I kind of got politicized on that channel. And in this new era where censorship seems to be more the norm, my channel was demonetized. Just as a side note, it happened the same week that I got a death threat. So I don't know if that's just a correlation or if there's an actual causation to that. But yeah, that's just the nature of my channel. I've been stuck at 19,200 subscribers for almost 18 months, which is almost damn near maddening, I would say. Especially since we really try to get to the heart of the truth, whereas other channels don't. They are more sensationalized, but they might get millions of subscribers. So I realized, you know what? I don't know if there's a solution to this, but at least I'm going to try to create a new channel and see if anything happens. Maybe I get more subscribers. Maybe I actually have a path beyond a shadow ban scenario, algorithmically demonetized scenario, something that I cannot see. I guess that's the part of it that makes it so maddening. But if there is a chance that I can get more subscribers, that I can actually create a future around this topic, which I love to cover, then so be it. It's worth a try. So having said all that, let's go ahead and take a look at this article. So this was written by the New York Post. And just based on the title, "A Look Inside People's Brains Who Say They've Had a UFO Encounter," I don't know what you're thinking, but I thought, man, are they trying to say that there's some kind of brain abnormality that is associated with alien abduction? People who claim these incredible stories related to the UAP and UFO phenomenon that has been recently confirmed by the government, are they now saying that the people who may have actually encountered the beings who are piloting those crafts, that those people are mentally disabled? Is that what this article is saying? To be frank, after reading it, that's what I thought. Well, at least at first. Then I started kind of breaking down very closely and I did some more research, and I realized that this is actually a framing issue, that this article is framing it like that, but what was actually ultimately said does not imply that at all. So if you go to Twitter, you can kind of get people's interpretation of the articles. So I made my own little comment on the fact that people may not be reading this article correctly, but it says here, "Can we look inside the ones who write these articles for science?" This guy says, "Dr. Garry Nolan was requested by the intelligence agencies to study the brain scans of pilots and intelligence staffers who had close contact with UAP. He did, and their brains were severely damaged. Science, thumbs up." And this user says, "It's called syndication. It happens a lot. You're welcome." What does the video camera's brains look like? Did you say you're looking for a brain? Well, that makes sense, I guess. A myth created by the U.S. Air Force. Makes complete sense. It's a praying hand. What are you praying? That thank God the alien abduction people are crazy, according to this framing? UFOs exist, period. I like that one. And probably my favorite one is this one right here with Homer Simpson. Just because it's an awesome GIF. Obviously, I don't think that these people are crazy. I don't think there's a monkey inside their heads battering their brains in and making them as dumb as Homer Simpson. And I'm going to explain exactly why this is the case. So, as the article says here, a professor has been testing the brains of people who say they've experienced a UFO encounter, and these are symptoms they display. Dr. Garry Nolan, a professor of pathology at Stanford University who has published more than 300 research articles and holds 40 US patents, has spent the past decade analyzing materials from alleged unidentified aerial phenomenon, UAP. Speaking to Vice's Motherboard, Nolan opened up about his work and revealed what sparked his interest in UAP. Nolan, who admitted to being an avid reader of science fiction, said his interest took flight when he reached out to a man named Stephen Greer, I'm sure a lot of you guys know who he is, who claimed a small skeleton was possibly an alien. It was eventually revealed that the skeleton was human, as it had a number of mutations in skeletal genes that could possibly explain the biology, Nolan explained. And I'm going to stop right here just to kind of talk about the framing aspect. So they start the article talking about this Stanford professor. And then the article goes on to talk about an alien skeleton that Dr. Greer has been skeptical about because it doesn't seem to resemble anything that is human-like. And then they explain that genetic analysis has shown that this alien skeleton was indeed human. So the framing is basically saying, well, Dr. Greer thought that there was an alien and there was no alien. It was just human. So what they're really talking about is this particular skeleton called the Atacama skeleton, which was found in Chile. And yeah, I mean, you look at this thing, it doesn't really look human. Really, what is so interesting about the skeleton is that it's only 6 inches long. So they did analysis and they said that this thing is human. Okay, maybe it is human, but it doesn't take away from the fact that this might be one in a kind in terms of archaeological history, which this particular article does not talk about and does not, quote unquote, frame it, that this is a complete, unique, ambiguous, and still to this day contested by many researchers. But that's not what the New York Post says. They just said that there's a guy here who's saying that people have brain abnormalities related to alien abduction. And he also proved that Dr. Greer's supposed alien is only human. That's what they're framing it as. Nolan published a paper titled Whole Genome Sequencing of Atacama Skeleton Shows Novel Mutations Linked with Dysplasia. Dysplasia, I guess, is the state of the bone prior to it being cancerous, which led the professor to be contacted by people linked to the CIA and various aeronautics corporations. His involvement with the UAP began after he was asked to use his blood analysis instrumentation to help with the cases of pilots who were close to alleged UAPs and horrible brain damage. When asked if he could describe the more abnormal effects on the brains observed with the MRIs, Nolan said, "If you ever looked at an MRI of somebody with multiple sclerosis, there's something called white matter disease. It's scarring." And once again, I'm going to go back to the argument that they are misframing this because there's another aspect of this story that they're not mentioning, which is so important that it literally completely churns the entire meaning of what this guy is actually analyzing 180 degrees. I mean, I'm talking about literally flipping the entire meaning of all of this. It's a big white blob, or maybe white blobs, scattered throughout the MRI. It's essentially dead tissue where the immune system had attacked the brain, he continued. That's probably the closest thing that you can come to if you wanted to look at a snapshot from one of those individuals. You can pretty quickly see that there is something wrong. Approximately 100 patients, mostly defense or government personnel or people working in the aerospace industry, were analyzed, Nolan told Motherboard. You have a smorgasbord of patients, some of whom had heard weird noises buzzing in their heads, got sick, etc., Nolan said. A reasonable subset of them had claimed to have seen UAPs, and some claimed to be close to things that got them sick. Ultimately, his team learned the people who they originally thought were damaged had an overconnection of neurons between the head of the caudates and the putamen. The number of people who had this overconnection led to the open question to come in contact with whatever it was, cause it or not. Nolan said that approximately a quarter of the MRI patients who claimed they had an encounter died from their injuries. So, okay, I'm going to stop right here, okay? So this is where the article starts becoming a little bit more accurate, but because of all these weird framing mechanisms, especially where they quote the guy saying, there is something wrong. I mean, you can look at these people and it's wrong. And then they talk about the, supposed skeleton from Dr. Greer that was debunked as they claimed. With all that, it makes you think, well, these are just people with head injuries. But the truth is, they start getting more accurate here. And what they're really saying is not, this is a direction of causality. The main question that this article should have framed it as is there are correlating brain effects with people who claim to have been damaged. People who claim to have encountered these crafts. In one case, it was the Skinwalker Ranch, and claimed that afterwards, not before, afterwards, that they felt like something damaged them. So the causation in that particular case is I encountered a UFO, UAP, a Skinwalker type phenomena. Now I feel brain damaged. How the article has been framing and how I think a lot of the Twitter people were thinking is that I had this disease or this brain issue before, thus I created this concept that UAPs exist. So that's the directionality of causation that is so important to pinpoint and to talk about, because the truth is, when you actually read the interview that happened with Dr. Nolan and Vice, you see that the causation is not what the framing mechanism seems to be. The causation is that these are highly intelligent individuals who then felt like they were damaged. And I'm about to prove this to you. And then they go on to talk about the NASA reports and how there's a jaw-dropping NASA report that basically talks about the possibility of extraterrestrial life existing. This came from the head of NASA. We actually made an episode about this. And then they talk about the basically all the UFO encounters that has been happening recently that seems to be very credible. Look, I don't know for certain whether the writer framed it incorrectly or whether it was just kind of incompetently written so as to confuse the user who is reading this. But let me go over the Vice interview and actually showcase to you what is really happening here. Oh, not this guy again. So first of all, the first thing I want to go over is the skeleton, because the article seemed to imply that Dr. Greer made some ridiculous claim that this might be an extraterrestrial, but later they discovered that he was wrong, that this is human. Well, if you go to the Wikipedia of that particular skeleton, the Atacama skeleton, this was discovered in Chile. This skeleton was only 6 inches long. And yes, there were genetic studies that seem to indicate that this is probably human, but at the same time, there are some weird things that are happening that nobody can explain. And as it says here, the researchers identified 64 unusual mutations in 7 genes linked to the skeletal system. And they noted that finding so many mutations that specifically affect skeletal development has never been reported before. I'm going to repeat that. Has never been reported before. In other words, this is not just a rarity. This is a one of a kind. Something that in the entire history of archaeology has never been seen. And it's very simple. The skeleton is 6 inches long. When they did a genetic analysis of that skeleton, it was said to have been maybe a 5 to 7 year old kid. So what is the shortest child in history? So the smallest man in history was 1 foot 9.5 inches. But what is the shortest child? The shortest child was measured at birth 11 inches. Okay? So we're not even talking about a close second. We're talking about literally 2 times the height. So the smallest human ever recorded at birth, not even at 5 or 7 years old, at birth, was twice the size of that thing. And then you're going to try to frame it like Dr. Greer is crazy for thinking that this is not normal for humans? Okay. Let's go further. Let's actually go over the genome studies. I'm going to straight to the academic papers here. And on the abstract, even the guys themselves who are studying this write in their abstract, together, these findings provide a molecular characterization of Atlas' peculiar phenotype, which likely results from multiple known and novel putative gene mutations. Putative is like alleged. or supposed to be. So I guess the definition is generally considered or reputed to be. So they're not even saying for certain. They're saying it's novel, supposed gene mutations. So they're saying that whatever this is something that is brand new that they've never seen before. And it's written very clearly in the abstract. So this is some commentary about the experiment. And it says here on the bottom, both the DNA studies and radiological review were conducted with the utmost respect. Dr. Latchman concluded that the skeleton possessed dysmorphias that were suggestive of a new syndrome, once again, new syndrome, or a complex interaction of several disorders. Only through additional analysis was it possible to determine definitively, so they couldn't even tell right away. It says here, only after additional analysis were they able to actually determine with certainty that the DNA was the DNA of a modern human. Here's a skeleton that has had more genetic mutations than has ever been seen in archaeological history, that is literally half the size of the smallest even child that has ever been born in the history of humanity. That this thing is not just a complete genetic, I hate to use the word freak, but very freakishly unusual. It's somehow with all these genetic mutations and all this stuff that makes absolutely no sense, just somehow survived up to the age of 5 or 7 years old. And then you're going to frame it as if Dr. Greer is crazy for thinking that this is not usual for humans. Okay, moving on. I wanted to get to the actual interview that Vice had with Dr. Nolan because it says here, can you describe the most anomalous effects on the brains you observed with the MRIs? If you've ever looked at an MRI of somebody with multiple sclerosis, there's something called white matter disease, scarring. It's a big white blob or multiple white blobs scattered throughout the MRI. It's essentially dead tissue where the immune system had attacked the brain. That's probably the closest thing that you can come to if you wanted to look at the snapshot from one of these individuals. You can pretty quickly see that there is something wrong. So what they're saying here is that all these people who claim to have been sick, claim to have been in contact with UAPs and not feeling well, here in the bottom, it talks about how there were around 100 patients and that these patients were essentially put in what is called like odd cases. They couldn't really figure out a reason for why they were being sick. So they kind of like put it in that bucket of things that weren't explained. And eventually when that bucket got filled enough and there was enough similarity between the cases that they then went further in trying to figure out what it is that this mysterious bucket is of this abnormality. And that is what Dr. Nolan was essentially doing. He was analyzing this strange anomalous bucket of people who felt sick, in which a large number had apparently come face to face or in the vicinity of a UAP, or in one case, the Skinwalker Ranch, that these particular individuals were having similar effects, but that could not be explained by the military or Department of Defense, however you want to think about it. And it says here, a reasonable subset of them had claimed to have seen UAPs, and some claimed to even be close to things that got them sick. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and this is what the article didn't make explicit. We started to notice that there are similarities in what we thought was the damage across multiple individuals. As we looked more closely, though, we realized, well, that can't be damaged, because that's right in the middle of the basal ganglia, a group of nuclei responsible for motor control and other core brain function. If those structures were severely damaged, these people would be dead. That was when we realized that these people were not damaged, but had an overconnection of neurons between the head of the caudates and the putamen. The caudate nucleus plays a critical role in various higher neurological functions. The putamen influences motor planning, learning, and execution. If you looked at 100 average people, you wouldn't see this kind of density. But these individuals had it. An open question is, very important open question, did coming in contact with whatever it was cause it or not? So in this particular paragraph, what they're talking about is that originally they saw this autoimmune related damage, which they called white blobs, but it's really the brain eating itself. So that was the initial thing that they discovered. And then after that, they discovered another similarity, which they originally thought was damage, but they realized was an overconnection of neurons. Very important here. For a couple of these individuals, we had MRIs from prior years. They had it before they had these incidents. Now, he's not talking about the general damage in the brain. He's talking about that particular density of neurons that these individuals had. So what does this mean? Well, it says here it was pretty obvious then that this was something that people were born with. It's a goal, a sub-goal setting planning device. It's called the brain within the brain. It's an extraordinary thing. This area of the brain is involved in what we call intuition. For instance, Japanese chess players were measured as they made what would be construed as brilliant decisions that is not obvious for anybody to have made that kind of leap of intuition. This area of the brain lights up. We had found people that had this in spades. These are also called high, let me repeat this. These are also called high functioning people. He's not saying that these people are brain damaged. He's saying that the brain damage that these people had then resulted in them thinking that there was another thing that was brain damage, but ended up being a concentration of neurons that is associated with high functioning people. He goes on to explain further. They are pilots who are making split-second decisions, intelligent officers in the field, etc. So what I'm taking out of this is that the people who happen to be the ones who are selected to be pilots or happen to be the ones who are selected to be intelligent officers happen to have this decision process, intuition part of the brain abnormally more dense than the average population, because these are individuals who were specifically selected because they were good at what they do. So they even go so far as to explain how everybody has this connectivity region in general, but let's say for the average person that the density level is 1. Most people in the study had 5, 10, and up to 15 times the normal density in this region. In this case, we're speculating that density implies some sort of neuronal function, not neuronal disability. Not I am a retard because I claim that I saw a UAP. They're claiming that these people are unusually gifted. And the article seemed to imply, at least in its framing, that the brain damage was a precursor of them seeing UAPs, when in reality, what this interview is saying is that, yes, there are 100 individuals who had brain damage, but when we looked at them more closely, we saw something that we initially thought was brain damage, but was something else. It showed us that these people are unusually smart, that these people are unusually intuitive and capable of making very quick decisions. That's what that is saying. And here's where it proves my case. The interviewer then asked, did the people who claimed that they had encountered, especially the pilots, describe any perceived decrease in neurological capacity? Of the 100 or so patients that we looked at, about a quarter of them died from their injuries. Now, if a quarter of these people died from what they said was injury, so when they talk about it up here, when he answers about what is common in these people, and he says, as we looked more closely, we realized that can't be damage, because that's right in the middle of the basal ganglia, and essentially these people would be dead. What that directly implies is that when they're talking about this particular thing that cannot be damaged, that he's not talking about the actual thing that they originally looked at when they experienced UAPs that was related to brain damage. Because that thing, according to the bottom, killed a quarter of the people. What he's saying up here is that we found something else. We found that these people are unusually smart, unusually capable. And that's the part that wasn't highlighted in the article, which really kind of frustrated me because I could see from the Twitter reactions that it really confused a lot of people. So in other words, if a quarter of the people died from brain damage, well, it can't be what they mistook to originally be brain damage, but ended up being a high concentration of neurons. You see what I'm saying? Like, these are not one and the same thing. What this interview ultimately implies is the causation that these effects may have actually been created by the presence of the UAP itself. As it says here on the bottom, how does the impact of electromagnetic frequencies factor into your hypothesis about what exactly transpired here? And they say, with one of the patients, it happened on its Skinwalker Ranch. Given how deep into the brain that damage went, we can actually estimate the amount of energy required in the electromagnetic wave someone aimed at them. We don't think that has anything to do with UAPs. We think that that's some sort of state actor, and again, related to the Havana Syndrome somehow. Now, the Havana Syndrome was that recent phenomenon that was occurring to diplomats, people who were in foreign countries, who suddenly had this excruciating migraine type pain in their head as if their brains was being microwaved by some kind of weapon. And it has been suggested by people of the Department of Defense that perhaps this is some kind of weapon, some kind of laser type of energy weapon where it can really bake these people's minds. And so because of the sensitive nature of the Department of Defense, there are certain aspects of this particular case that they're not allowed to talk about. But what they're saying is that people who came across UAPs apparently had the same type of damage that was associated with Havana Syndrome. Now, he might imply here that maybe it's not UAPs, maybe it's some kind of weapon, but the directionality is still the same, that these people got brain damage after they supposedly encountered a UAP. So I don't care if you believe if it was UAP or some kind of death ray. What I care about is explaining to the audience that the directionality of causation is that this particular brain damage happened after the events, not that these people were brain damaged before they claim that UAPs are real. Is there anything man-made that might have this impact on the brain? The only thing I can imagine is you're standing next to an electric transformer that's emitting so much energy that you're basically getting burned inside your body. That's his best description of how this could have been made by man. I mean, obviously he seems to lean towards the idea of this being related to whatever creates the Havana Syndrome, like maybe some kind of death ray. But the direction of causality, to me, is the most important thing. It's the fact that these people were highly intelligent, highly capable individuals who then had brain damage as a result of some phenomena that remains to be solved. As a caveat, I don't know, I just had a problem with this sentence. I'm open to being wrong, except most of the time, I know I'm probably right. Okay, well, isn't that like a contradiction? Like, if you believe that most of the time you're probably, you know that you're probably right, isn't that contradictory to the idea of being open-minded to being wrong? Just thought that was kind of a funny statement. Now, what's so interesting about Dr. Nolan is he's actually analyzed materials that supposedly came out of UAP crafts. And, this is a common phenomenon where people sometimes will see like what looks to be like a flying saucer that's in distress, and suddenly they dump out what looks like molten metal. Like, I've heard this in so many different cases. And so people have actually gone and grabbed the material, the molten metal. And what he's saying here is that there's something very strange about at least some of the samples that they gathered. One of the materials from the Ubatuba events, a UAP event in Brazil, has extraordinary altered isotope ratios of magnesium. It was interesting because other pieces from the same event was analyzed in the same instrument at the same time. This is an extraordinarily sensitive instrument called the NanoSIMS, secondary ion mass spectrometer. It had perfectly correct isotope ratios for what would be expected for magnesiums found anywhere on Earth. The problem is there's no good reason humans have for altering the isotope ratios for a simple metal like magnesium. There's no different properties of different isotopes that anybody, at least in any of the literature that is public, of the hundreds of thousands of papers published that say this is why you would do that. Now, you can do it. It's a little expensive to do, but you'd have no reason for doing it. What that means is that if you find a metal where the isotope ratios are charged far beyond what is normally found in nature, then that material has likely been engineered. The material is downstream of a process that caused them to be altered. Someone did it. The questions are who and why. So to preface this paragraph, they basically talk about the events of UAPs dropping off these isotopes. And in the bottom, he asks, if there's altered isotope ratios, are they using the altered isotope ratios? Are the altered ratios the result of the propulsion mechanism? Again, pure speculation. When the ratios get that far out of whack, do they have to offload because it's no longer useful in propulsion? Now, what amazes me is here, Dr. Nolan seems to have no problem speculating on the possibility of this being some kind of propulsion for UAPs. But for whatever reason, when it comes to this brain issue that people are having after they encounter UAPs, he seems to associate it with some kind of potential death rate that is the same thing that created the Havana Syndrome. Just because the results, the autoimmune reaction of the brain seems to be similar, which I just don't understand how he comes to that conclusion. So he looks at strange materials. I think he had like 12 different samples, and 2 of them had isotope levels that were way off, that makes no sense, that implies they were being engineered, that seems to have no benefit to humanity, that's very expensive to make. And then he actually at one point like speculates that maybe it's something to do with propulsion of UAPs. But then when it comes to people who actually claim that they saw UAPs, he's like, nah, it's probably some kind of like death ray. Ultimately, I don't care what his opinion is. What I care about is getting the facts correct and also correcting this framing mechanism to make it seem like people who are seeing this have been crazy all along. They make it seem like Dr. Greer, who claimed he had seen an extraterrestrial, they make specific reference that was debunked by the skeptics. Yeah, debunked in what sense? That they have some similar DNA to humans? But there's nothing in that article that explains how unusual that skeleton actually is. One out of, I don't know, every human to ever exist in this freaking planet that we can record through archaeology, through anthropology, and they don't think to mention that? That is so shady, man. So look, I really believe that these people experienced something extraordinary, that these people were highly affected. I forgot who mentioned this, but somebody was saying that if you see a UFO, don't point a gun at it. And a lot of people like to put like these high-powered lasers or high-powered lights. Don't do that. Because whatever it is that these UFOs emit at you, it seems to affect the people in a negative way. Like being hit by a linebacker 1,000 times in your lifetime type way. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. My next episode, I am going to be... Look, this is one of those episodes where I'm almost certain that I'm going to lose subscribers because I'm going to be debunking a very popular UFO channel on YouTube. I'm sure a lot of you, ladies and gentlemen, already know what I may be talking about. But part of the reason why I built this channel was because there were other channels that were just putting out what I thought to be crap out there. And so it was really important for me to always be honest with the audience, always be 100% reflective. If I'm wrong, I will say it. I once taped what I thought was a UFO on the moon, and I literally had to admit that, look, maybe that was a bird that I just didn't realize. And I admitted that because we can't get to the truth and we can't be credible unless we're transparent and actually critical. I believe that if you're watching this show, the chances are you probably believe in UFOs and probably believe in the idea of extraterrestrial aliens. So if we already agree that these things exist, our next step should be to try to make this field as credible as possible. So we don't need more evidence to prove to us that these things are real. We need to make sure that the bad evidence is not out there that would taint the whole field of ufology. And that's why I would make an episode where I try to debunk a video from a very popular UFO YouTube channel. Thank you so much for following me. I know it was a long episode, but hopefully you found the information very informative. This is Felipe speaking, signing out.